If you've ever read a top 10 or top 25 episodes list of a TV show, almost always the pilot episode will be included on the list. Often I get the sense that it's because the episode was where it all began, and so it's for sentimental reasons. However, I often see pilots included because they set up the style of the shows so well that people instantly became hooked, and the shows went on to great success after that. As far as theatrical films go, I think Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is a good example of a pilot film. It captures the spirit of the book so well that it becomes darn near impossible to imagine another big screen interpretation of these characters and events. The rest of the franchise either follows or builds upon the style and tone set from the first film so as to make a cohesive set of films. Sure, Stone's a little rocky at times, and other films would improve upon various elements, but it's hard not to have a soft spot for the one that started it all. But Dr. No isn't a great Bond film because it's the template that all would follow afterwards. It's a terrific Bond film because it's a great streamlined adventure film. Being one of the more faithful adaptations from Fleming's original novels, Dr. No is not a film with deep characters, captivating arcs, or compelling ideas. It's a film about a British agent solving a murder mystery which unravels into a greater plot of controlling US rocket launches. There's not a whole lot of thematic complexity or deep story arcs here, but I don't say that as a criticism. Not every film is trying to be the final word on its subject. Some just want to be escapist fun, and that's not a lesser or easier task than making a deep and compelling dramatic thesis of a film. We've seen plenty of efforts like Uncharted, Lara Croft Tomb Raider, and National Treasure that have tried to tackle the elements of an old-fashioned adventure serial. And while those films have their fans and succeed to one degree or another, I think most would agree that they pale in comparison to something like Raiders of the Lost Ark, which somehow captured that elusive lightning in a bottle. And despite that film being fairly light on character and thematic depth, most film fans would still rank Raiders as one of the best films ever made, alongside efforts like Casablanca, Citizen Kane, and Schindler's List. Now don't get me wrong, entertainment and thematic depth are not mutually exclusive concepts. There are plenty of films out there that are great blendings of the two. Films like The Dark Knight, Mad Max Fury Road, any of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and The Empire Strikes Back are some of my favorite examples of this. Even later Bond films are decent examples of this, like On Her Majesty's Secret Service and Casino Royale. But the early Bond films wanted to be fun escapist outings, and their phenomenal success in that realm is worthy of being studied, much like I would recommend studies of films from that time like Lawrence of Arabia, The Sound of Music, and Dr. Strangelove. The plot isn't that much more complicated than what I said it was. Two British operatives are killed in Jamaica after being sent as a favor to the United States to follow up on some radio interference with their rocket launches. James Bond is called in to investigate, and he immediately finds himself in a dangerous arena. Almost half the people he meets are against him and trying to kill him. With the help of CIA agent Felix Leiter, a local fisherman named Quarrel, and a diver named Honey Ryder, Bond deduces that Dr. No may be the key factor in this plot. All of this leads to a showdown with Bond and Dr. No, with the fate of the space race in the balance. Dr. No is a fairly well-paced film, in that almost every scene is either developing the plot or showing Bond on the move. Much like when Jaws was adapted into a film, the streamlining of the extra elements from the book leads to a more cohesive whole. The film is about a murder mystery, and it tries to leave anything out from the novel that has nothing to do with that, like the business of endangered birds as being a further reason to investigate Dr. No. A lot of the details of characters' backgrounds are gone, and the final scenes in Jamaica after escaping Crab Key. An idea that's carried over from the novels that I'm particularly fond of is Bond already being a veteran in the service by the time we meet up with him. In the original Casino Royale novel, it doesn't begin at the very start of Bond's service in MI6. Realistically, if he's supposed to be a 00 agent, which is a position that's held in great honor and only a handful of operatives have been given that distinction, then you cannot show Bond being promoted to that position after only one assignment in the service. Here, The Dr. No assignment can't even be said to be the first job the cinematic Bond has as a 00 agent in the films. Although it's never stated the specific circumstances of the job, the reason for switching out the pistols at the start of this film is because the Beretta jammed on the last job, and M wants to see his 00s have the best equipment possible. So this just happens to be the first film we see of this man and his adventures, and it's not Bond Begins. That said, Dr. No still works as a proper beginning to the film series because it establishes a number of things that would help solidify a soft continuity moving forward. The Walther PPK, Felix Leiter, Sylvia Trench, and Spectre are all things that will come back in later films, with the reintroduction of several of those things coupled with a reference to the events of this film. When it comes to starting a franchise, casting is key. I've gotten a lot of flack in the comments for my Bond actors ranking video for not having Sean Connery in my personal top 3. So allow me to use these next few reviews to help set the record straight. I don't dislike Connery as Bond at all. He's absolutely wonderful in the role and deserves all the credit he gets for establishing the cinematic version of the character. And yet, I still prefer some of the other guys. If I may, I'd like to give an example to illustrate how much of a dilemma this is and how much I like all of the Bond actors. Say you are given the task of picking the most perfect casting in comic book film history from one of these 5 choices. Which one would you pick? For some, this is an easy task, but for a lot of us, this is near impossible, as all 5 have strong arguments to be made for them. But that doesn't mean the others aren't also worthy of consideration. And that's how I feel about Connery as Bond. He's a clear contender for the best Bond ever, and he does have the added benefit of being the first in the official series. If it makes you feel any better, think of my Bond actor ranking as a bit like a tier list. Lazenby is the only one who's not in that top tier. Sean Connery slips perfectly into the role as Bond like he came straight off the page. It's not quite his best performance, and it's not even necessarily representative of what Connery's era would be known for, but any fears about his casting are squashed soundly within the first few minutes. His introduction as Bond is by far the best in the series, which is interesting to me because it's a brand new addition for the film. In the book, Bond is introduced in M's office in a rather mundane, routine manner. In the film, Bond is playing baccarat against Sylvia Trench in a swanky club. I do wonder if this scene is somewhat of an homage to the opening scene of Casino Royale, where Bond is introduced in a casino overlooking someone playing baccarat. However, it's a great improvement even from that scene, because within a few minutes you get everything you need to know about Bond for the rest of the series. He's suave, charming, a womanizer, is a veteran in the service, and puts the job before pleasure. I would put the introduction of James Bond in this film up there with other great character introductions like Lawrence of Arabia or The Man with No Name. As far as other casting goes in the film, it's pretty great. Bernard Lee instantly establishes the role of M as written in the books, and my appreciation of him only goes up every time I reread those stories. Lois Maxwell only gets the 2 short scenes, but she also perfectly establishes the relationship between Bond and Moneypenny going forward. I never got the idea that she truly wanted to be with Bond, but that she loved flirting with him, and that was the basis of their friendship. As odd as it may be to say, I don't think the Bond-Moneypenny dynamic ever worked as well in the series as it did with Maxwell and Connery. There was just something between those two that sparkled. Lazenby did okay in his one go. Moore had a somewhat different relationship with her. Caroline Bliss never really got all that much interesting to do with Dalton, and Naomi Harris never quite clicked with me with Craig. The closest for me would be Brosnan and Samantha Bond, and even then, they only had 2 great interactions. Jack Lord is one of my favorite versions of Felix Leiter, precisely because he feels like a kindred spirit to Bond. He's not exactly the Americanized version of 007, but I can easily buy their fast friendship. It's a shame that Lord either could not or did not want to return for the subsequent films, as Connery's era never found a good replacement for him, with the possible exception of Bernie Casey in Never Say Never Again. While I don't care much for the character herself, Ursula Andress is perfect as Honey Rider. She's got the naive innocence down, as well as being effortlessly sexy. Ryder is kind of the ultimate red-blooded male fantasy image of a Bond woman, which works for this outing, and I imagine that's why so many of us rank her highly. Quarrel is a very likable Bond ally, with one of the most chilling deaths in the series for me. The rest of the bit parts all do their jobs well, with particular mention going to Anthony Dawson as Professor Dent. That's not just because Dawson went on to play Blofeld in 2 later installments, but because I think he best conveys the sense of overwhelming power that Dr. No has over the Kingston area. He has such fear in his eyes when he goes to Crab Key and speaks with Dr. No, which is the first real glimpse we have of that character. Plus, the cold kill with him is one of Connery's finest moments as Bond, and it does not work unless both actors are playing their parts well. Speaking of Dr. No, I've already covered a lot about what I wanted to say about this guy in my villains ranking. His role in the story is that of a usurping king that quickly establishes his hold over the area. Many answer to him, and those that don't are either eliminated or give him a wide berth. He doesn't have nearly enough screen time for me, and he's so captivating that I wish he was brought back for one more installment. Joseph Wiseman was apparently very nervous when he did this role, and yet that weirdly translates to a mild-mannered coldness which is very effective. He's just matter-of-fact about a lot of things, and it's only when his plan fails that he gets rageful. He's a great start to the series' excellent tradition of villains. Several production elements stand out to me. Let's cover music first. If you've seen my Soundtracks of Bond video, you'll know that I'm not a fan of Monty Norman's score overall. I just find the whole product to be too similar in recording and mixing techniques to several older films, like from the 1940s and the 1950s. There are plenty of 1960s orchestral scores at this time that sounded lush and vibrant and forward-thinking, and this score sounds muted and cheap and backwards looking to me. It uses some very trite and obvious techniques of film scoring that bugs me. For example, there's a term in scoring called Mickey Mousing, which basically has the music substitute in part for the sound in some places. If you think of cartoons like Looney Tunes and Tom and Jerry, you've probably seen examples of this, where xylophones match the footsteps of a sneaking character, or a cymbal crash represents someone's face being smashed in. It's something I think rarely works in more serious films. A prime example in this film to me is the tarantula scene. Timing Bond's shoe impacts with the orchestral beats sounds very silly and over the top to me. I also think the score is a bit too sparse for my liking. Now, I'm not advocating for the John Williams technique where there's music playing every minute, but a lot of the key scenes from this film don't have music. Some of that makes sense, like the cold kill with Professor Dent. But the over-reliance on musical silence feels a bit incongruous within a film that also likes to use the James Bond theme a lot in the first half, even when he's like walking towards a car or something. I'm not crazy, it does feel like something's missing at certain points of this film, right? Speaking of which, the best piece of music in this film is undoubtedly John Barry's standout arrangement of the James Bond theme. It's one of the most iconic pieces of music in film history. Everyone knows this theme, and every official Bond production uses it multiple times. It often provides the best musical moments in each of the films, and that's because it's one of the few pieces of film music that transcends the actor playing the character. No matter who's playing the role, this song fits the interpretation and is an instant thrill generator. Even most of the video games knew the power of this song. A lot of the GoldenEye 64 score is just remixes of this theme, and it's an excellent offering. Agent Under Fire can't go 3 minutes without playing the tune. Quantum of Solace correctly puts aside David Arnold's rather excellent outings and provides its own unique flavor, which uses the Bond theme galore. I don't know what else I can say. With a few exceptions, there has rarely been a more perfect marriage of music to film than the James Bond theme. I've never really paid attention to the costume design of this film before this viewing. Bond's great sense of style is established from frame 1, but he's not the only one that should get a mention. At Crab Key, Dr. No is styled in more Eastern-influenced clothing, and that makes sense given his background. But the wardrobe provided to Bond and Honey is also influenced by the same style, and is unlike anything else they wear in the film, which helps to clue the audience into the fact that we have stepped into Dr. No's world, and he controls the elements here. Much like the shipwrecked Duke Prospero in The Tempest, he might be a minnow pretending he's a whale, but nothing happens on the island without his say, and he is confident in his dominance. Here's the section of the review where I make a few minor observations. I know this film was made for about $1 million at the time, and honestly, a lot of it looks really good even today, but the rear projections are pretty awful. I think my issue is that we hold on to the shots too long, and so I can't help but notice them. As I said, most of the rest of this film looks great, particularly once it went through the Lowry digital restoration process back in 2008. On the Ultimate Edition DVD, it looked better than it ever had, and now with the Blu-ray and streaming versions out, this thing looks pristine. A lot of the locations are pretty terrific too. The beach at Crab Key is on my short list of places to visit if I ever go to Jamaica. While I praise the film for being economical with its pacing, there are some moments where the film slows down a bit too much for me. Bond crawling through the vents at Crab Key, the scenes with Miss Taro at her house, and the length of Dr. No's toppling of the rocket are key issues for me. I've mentioned that there are some notable changes from the book that I think actually help to improve the story for the film, such as adding Felix Leiter into this plot. But one change that doesn't do anything for me is the tarantula. In the novel, it was a centipede. Yeah, I'm more scared of spiders than I am of centipedes, but there's at least a basis for centipedes killing people. Unless Bond is allergic to a spider bite, all he's in for is a rough night at the most. 1962's Dr. No made quite the entrance for James Bond into cinemas. From the very beginning, many of the key elements for a Bond film are put into place, and the series has always looked back to the first 3 Connery films in some way for inspiration. The gun barrel at the start, the flashy titles, lines like Bond, James Bond, exotic locations, beautiful women, an elegant sense of style, death-defying action, dangerous villains with grandiose plans, and a strong leading hero at the center of it all. Dr. No serves as the perfect introduction to the classic run of Bond films. It's an essential watch for all cinema fans, even if its style would be perfected in later adventures. It's not a particularly deep film, but it's an exquisite start to an excellent film series.
Friends call me Tanya.
Mine call me James Bond.
For the longest time, sequels had the reputation of being letdowns. Not that everything about them necessarily sucked, but that they certainly failed to be solid follow-ups to their acclaimed predecessors. Jaws 2, The Exorcist 2, More American Graffiti, Son of the Mask, and Blues Brothers 2000 come to my mind when talking about poor encores. Yet these days, thankfully, it's not hard to cite examples of great sequels. The Godfather Part 2, Star Trek The Wrath of Khan, The Dark Knight, Lord of the Rings The Two Towers, A Shot in the Dark, The Empire Strikes Back, Mad Max The Road Warrior. The list is growing larger and larger with each passing year. And this certainly is the case with From Russia with Love. Dr. No was already an excellent first try, but Russia builds upon its successes, cements more of the typical Bond elements, and ups the scale and scope. And beyond that, it's just a darn good spy film. For years, this was my favorite of the entire series, and I know I'm not alone in giving it that distinction. This was Connery's favorite of all of his Bond films, as well as being the favorite of many Bond alumni, like later Bond's Timothy Dalton and Daniel Craig, which is not surprising given the tones of their respective films, producer Harry Saltzman, writer Richard Maybaum, Lois Maxwell, Michael G. Wilson, and Barbara Broccoli. Cubby Broccoli cited this as one of his 3 favorite entries. President John F. Kennedy listed the book as being a favorite of his. Even Ian Fleming at one time claimed this to be the best of his novels. Heck, the producers even used the bedroom scene with Tatiana and Bond as part of the screen testing process for each new actor to this day. So as you can imagine, this is quite a daunting film to tackle. But I'm going to do my level best to try and dissect this film and explain to you why I think it deserves to be remembered as one of the greats. Russia features what is, to my mind, one of the best plotted stories of the entire series. A beautiful Russian cipher clerk has found a file photo of James Bond and has fallen in love with him. She wants to defect to the West as long as Bond brings her in himself. The enticement is that she'll be bringing along a Lecter decoding machine, which would enable MI6 to decode any messages they intercept from the Soviets. M and Bond know this is very likely a trap, but the chance of getting a Lecter is too much to pass up. Little do all parties involved know that it's the organization Spectre that is behind this plot, and plans to humiliate MI6, kill Tanya, and get revenge on Bond for killing their operative Dr. No. Bond heads to Istanbul and gets embroiled in the espionage game with the Russians, all the while with Spectre waiting in the shadows for their chance to emerge victorious against the survivors. This is an example of a model sequel, in that it builds upon the first film's ideas and story and deepens the experience. You don't have to have seen Dr. No in order to understand this film, but it's made very clear that Bond's involvement in the story is precisely because of his actions from the first film. Often in this series, Bond is solely involved in the story because he's the agent MI6 sends out. I think it's a far more interesting hook when Bond has a personal stake in the mission or is in some way tied to the plot. The world also starts to feel a little bigger here. We get a better sense of what Spectre is in relation to the world governments at the time, a third party that is loyal to no one but themselves and sows chaos wherever they can. Certainly Spectre isn't finished by the end of this story, but you know that they are lurking in the shadows and will be back to finish off Bond at some point in a future film. We also get our first glimpse of Blofeld, which now gives us a trajectory for the series to build towards. Russia also, intentionally or otherwise, cements some more of the standard elements of the Bond formula. The gun barrel is definitively made part of the opening of almost all subsequent films. We get a pre-credits sequence. The titles involve a gorgeous song that is interwoven throughout the score of the film, and also features wonderful images integrated with the credits. We get our first proper gadget, as well as the introduction of Desmond Llewellyn and his Q. John Barry sets forth a great example of a Bond score. Bond has a separate female companion for almost every film to follow. The villains have a fantastic henchman, and the end of the film promises that James Bond will return. I really think Goldfinger is the true template for the rest of the series to follow, but that film is certainly building off of the elements from both Dr. No and from Russia with Love. A key difference between this and some of the other films in the series is where the emphasis is placed. When asked about how to keep the audience engaged with films, some filmmakers simplify the issue by saying we need more action, twists and turns, and great visuals. While those are wonderful tools to be used to keep interest in the story, the first 3 Connery films prove that there are more ways beyond these to tell a different kind of Bond story with each film. Dr. No is an investigation story. Goldfinger focuses a bit more on escapist entertainment and action, and From Russia with Love is a tension-filled Cold War story. The thrills delivered here are not because of great stunts or action sequences, although there are a few really good ones here, but because of the layout of the plot. It's the intrigue that captivates us. We know Spectre is in the background and Bond will have to face off with them at some point, but the ball's entirely in their court. It's quite a risky move not to have the protagonist drive the events of the film forward like we had in Dr. No and like we will have in Goldfinger. Yet Bond is such a great vessel that we can still be entertained knowing that he is playing Spectre's game for much of the film. That's what makes the train fight so monumental. It's not that it's just a great fight scene in a film that's been rather devoid of action up to that point. It's a scene that changes the course of the narrative in a meaningful way. Bond finally gets the upper hand and starts to fight back against Spectre, and they are dealt another solid blow in their machinations. Sean Connery is just spectacular here. He did a phenomenal job already, but in this film he grows even more confident in the role. He just is Bond. His sense of style, his humor, his assuredness, and his charm are all near the top of the peak for Bond actors. The bedroom scene is probably the single most sexy scene in all of the classic run of films. I think this is the moment when the audience all decide how they are going to view this character. They either want to be him or they want to be with him. And yet, somewhat incredibly, Connery gets even better in the next film, but we'll save that for another day. Tanya is a solid Bond woman, and an interesting one to compare to her immediate predecessor. Whereas Honey Rider was only involved in the third act, and even then as someone to accompany Bond, Tanya is a central character here. She's the one that kills Klebb, makes sure that Spectre cannot get their hands on the Lecter, and even decides to follow through with her cover story. I'm with Calvin Dyson in that I'm not sure when she actually falls in love with Bond, but I'm fairly certain it has to be before she admits it to Bond in the train. Daniela Bianchi fulfills a tall order in performing this role. She hardly spoke English, and she was only 21 when she did this film, I think thus making her the youngest actress to play a Bond woman. Her dubbing is pretty solid throughout, but there are certainly some moments where I can tell it's not her voice. Barbara Jefford performed the vocals here, and she would even be brought back to dub other women in the series, including Molly Peters in Thunderball, and apparently Caroline Munro in The Spy Who Loved Me. It was probably right that the Bond series continued onwards with a new woman every installment, but I wish I knew what happened to Tanya after this story. She's unceremoniously dropped and we never hear from her again, which is odd given that she only really defected to the West because of Bond. I get why Honey Rider might not come back. She was tied into the Jamaican area and had no reason to follow Bond back to England. But Tanya does, and so I'm a bit thrown off with the choice of never mentioning her again. The Fleming books often came up with reasons why the main Bond woman of the previous story couldn't be back for this adventure, so I'm not sure why the producers decided to go this route. I do love the hints we get from Tanya that she's enjoying the switch up to a Western style of life, with her fascination of the fancy clothes and seeming to offer up fantasies of what her life will eventually be like. In the novel, Fleming certainly wrote with this attitude of, the West rocks. It's interesting to compare Tanya with Red Grant there, as I think they're intended to complement each other. They're both agents for SMERSH who are thoroughly committed to communist ideals. The film series chooses to de-emphasize these political aspects, and while that makes the film adaptations of the original stories less interesting to analyze on a thematic level, I think it was ultimately the right move. Covey Broccoli felt that the Cold War wasn't going to last forever, and thus avoided explicitly making certain nations the enemies for Bond. It's a forward-thinking attitude that actually helps to make the series feel more timeless. If you know the Cold War, you can appreciate the atmosphere and tensions that permeated the series well into the 1980s. However, if you decide to detach your viewing experience from that part of history, these films still work surprisingly well for a casual audience. I've already said a lot about what I wanted to cover with Red Grant in my recent Bond henchman ranking video, so I won't spend a lot of time on him here. Suffice it to say, he is the standout villain for the film. He doesn't even speak until 80 minutes in, and yet he's the first villain that comes to my mind when I think of this film. Rosa Klebb works very well for being the principal Spectre agent of this story, but she personally doesn't have a whole lot of color for me. Again, if you know the book, you can read into certain performance choices of Lotte Lenya's in order to enrich the character, but I can't tell if these choices were Lenya's ideas or if they were in the screenplay. I also love Blofeld's presence here. He's not really necessary for the story itself, but his appearance is a great foundational element for later entries, seeding the eventual climax between him and Bond. The weak link here is Kronstein. Vladek Shabal gives a creepy performance, but I feel like he's just here to force the chess master image into the story. I feel like he could have been cut out or condensed with someone else. The 2005 video game adaptation gives a lot of his lines to Kleb, which makes sense given that she was head of strategic operations for SMERSH. I think inserting this character into the mix was an oversight on the writer's parts, though I'm inclined to blame Joanna Harwood, as she claimed in a later interview that anything resembling the original story came from her, and Kronstein was a character there. Alongside Red Grant, my favorite new character here is Karen Bay. Pedro Armendariz brings a lot of the same warmth and likability to the character as was in the book. He's the guide for the audience to this world, and I love his rapport with Bond. He's right up there with Jeffrey Wright's interpretation of Felix Leiter as someone I wish I could have seen team up with Bond for more adventures. I think my favorite bit with him is when he kills Krylenko. It's such a tense scene, and Armendariz plays it very well. The MI6 regulars still do a great job here. This is probably my favorite M scene with Connery, as it feels more like a frank conversation than a standard briefing. Moneypenny also gets some of her best moments here. I'll repeat a point I made in my Dr. No review. Lois Maxwell and Sean Connery just had the best chemistry of any of the Bond Moneypenny pairings. Desmond Llewellyn makes his first appearance as Boothroyd, but it's not really a scene that's treated with much fanfare. Now, to be fair, this was a scene that was written for Peter Burton, but when he couldn't return, Desmond stepped in. He's a little bit more animated in his facial expressions than Burton was, and so he endears himself to the audience more, and I'm happy he came back for later installments. I've said before that this isn't an action film really, but there are some noteworthy moments here. The Gypsy Camp fight comes to mind as it's a great example of how an action scene can be used to illustrate the film's themes on a visual scale. The fight is a microcosm of the larger story, in that the Russians are fighting against Bond and his allies, but Spectre will nudge it along however they need to. I also like the boat chase, as it leads to some of the best shots in the series, but the real standout should be obvious. It's the confrontation between Grant and Bond. It not only contains one of the best fight scenes in all of cinema, but it does a great job of giving us enough of Grant's character so that we're invested in the stakes of the fight. Grant is a true anti-Bond, with all of the training, skills, and confidence, but he just happens to work on the side of evil. It's only when he veers from his job and allows his own personal ambitions into the arena that Bond is able to take advantage of him. This scene has so many great moments of dialogue that are some of my favorites in the series. Robert Shaw and Sean Connery show off their theater acting chops here, and it's hard not to be silenced into captivation. My hair just stands up on end. The fight afterwards is an example of more bloody combat that I just adore seeing. You can feel the sweat and exertion from each of these guys. The blows hit hard, and we're excited to see Bond find a way to get the upper hand in the fight. I also want to talk about the suitcase here. It's one of my favorite gadgets in the series. It was featured in the book, but the creativity on display with it here is just inspired. The features are general enough that we can see how it might be useful to field agents in a variety of situations, and yet a lot of them fit perfectly within this plot. Not all of the features are used later in the story, but I really dig that. Sometimes the series features a gadget that feels like it was just made for the one specific scene in which Bond needs it, and then it might be discarded almost immediately. This briefcase was the breakthrough for all gadgets to follow, and I wouldn't mind Bond still having something like this around for future adventures. Sid Kane takes over art direction duties from Ken Adam. While it does have some unique touches of its own, it feels like it's part of the same world as Dr. No, thus building a sense of cohesion with this series. Kane would be brought back to work on several later Bond adventures, basically whenever they couldn't get Ken here. He also designed On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Live and Let Die, and would even be a storyboard artist as late as GoldenEye. Peter Hunt is the real MVP of the crew here. It's widely known that this film was heavily reworked in the editing process, and I really appreciate how well Hunt knows the ebbs and flows of movie storytelling. Plus, I hear he's responsible for the reason we have a pre-title sequence, and I can't imagine this series without that staple. However, there are a couple of bits where the editing stands out. Certainly there are speed-ups and jump cuts, but there are certain lines which don't make sense. There's a line from Bond regarding Grant's supposed comments about the film reel that doesn't make sense, as that particular bit was excised from the train sequence. Also, Tanya has a line to Bond about an agent following them while they're on the boat in Istanbul, but of course we don't see any agent following them. I also have to give a shout out to Robert Brownjohn. While Maurice Binder often gets the credit for the Bond title sequences, I think Brownjohn deserves some credit too. Binder's sequence for Dr. No always felt a bit jarring to me, whereas Brownjohn's sequence here feels much more fitting. He decides to go for projections on women's figures, which is a simple idea that is later refined for Goldfinger, and yet I feel like the first title sequence that would become the template for later films, Thunderball, works because Binder takes Brownjohn's ideas and reimagines them to work in his own wheelhouse. I've already spoken a bit about John Barry's score elsewhere, but I can't help but sing its praises once again. This is totally different from Monty Norman's effort, and it's a much more fitting one. The lush strings, the quiet suspense pieces, and the implementation of the percussion all help to give this film its own unique sound while setting the course for the rest of the series. The instrumental versions of the main theme are my preferred versions of the song, and it's one of the most hummable themes for me. Having bongos was a great way to keep the more exotic nature of Istanbul in the music. It's not exactly what the Turkish traditional musical character sounds like, but it's a great way of keeping one foot in that world. The string segments reminds me a bit more of great musical scores at the time, like Lawrence of Arabia, which helps to add to the film's mystique for me. Barry's integration of the Bond theme is great here too. The James Bond with bongos piece always stuck with me. However, it's not the only place where Barry uses the theme. It's in the pre-title sequence, it's in the main title sequence, it's a transitionary piece of music, and it plays in one of my favorite subtler ways when Bond throws the man overboard. I also adore the Hagia Sophia suspense piece. Great job, Barry. You've secured yourself a standing invitation to come back and do 10 more films. There are a few more bits that I don't feel work as well as they should. The gypsy camp sequence is great, but I feel like the segment with the girl fight goes on a bit too long. I love the belly dancer bit and wouldn't change that, and I adore the shootout later, but I felt the length of the combined sequence a bit on my most recent rewatch, so I probably would have trimmed it there. I also think the train fight does such a good job that it overshadows the rest of the film that follows it. It's not that the third act suddenly becomes bad, it just lulls a bit for me in excitement. I do love the helicopter bit though. Yeah, it's an obvious lift from Hitchcock, but I like the change from a plane to a helicopter. It makes the scene feel a bit faster, and you can make the passes more often and get them closer to Bond. As I've said, this score is incredible, but the one bit I feel like the music needed a bit more work was in the hotel scene where Bond searches for bugs. Bringing back the original arrangement of the James Bond theme is fine, but I hate how the volume levels for the song are all over the place. Sometimes it feels far too soft, and other times it's far too loud. I feel like that bit needed another couple of passes from the mixing people. Finally, I'd like to point out that I do not believe this is Ian Fleming. I wish he had made a more explicit appearance in this series, but I found far too much evidence against this particular person being the original author. From Russia with Love is a terrific follow-up to Dr. No that I believe surpasses it. It's such a classic in the eyes of the public that it's often held alongside Goldfinger as one of the ultimate examples of Bond films. I was a bit apprehensive coming back to this one, as I'm worried the luster and magic of this film will fade on repeat viewings, but once again, that fear was unwarranted. This is the only Bond film I currently own in a digital format, and it's a pleasure to revisit the film every so often. I personally hold it up as one of the great films of the 1960s for cinephiles, alongside the likes of Lawrence of Arabia, 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and Psycho. From Russia with Love was another indication of the oncoming phenomenon, and yet it wouldn't be until the next film when the dam would burst open and the spy deluge will drown us all. When a film is considered a bona fide classic by so many other people, it's hard to go against the grain. If you're someone my age, but you don't care for Ghostbusters, The Princess Bride, or The Lord of the Rings, you're often treated with a little disdain. If you're a film critic and don't like Annie Hall, Ben-Hur, or The Godfather, I imagine you might have had a few tense moments when talking about those films with other critics. So what do you do if you like a particular film, but not as much as everyone else does? That's the case with me and Goldfinger. I have a great time while watching it, it's in my top 10 Bond films of all time, and I understand the love. However, it's never been the pinnacle of my preferences in Bond films, and that's a strange camp to be a part of. I agree with most of the positives given out. Most of the cast are peak examples of their respective categories. Connery gives his best performance of the series, it contains the best villain plot, and it's one of the most fun outings. It just so happens I have several films that I like more. And yet I feel like I'm committing a crime when I admit that and don't place Goldfinger at the top of everything Bond related. Regardless of how I ultimately land on this film, it will continue to be a timeless juggernaut of pop culture, and deservedly so. It ushered in the Bond mania of the 60s, and to this day, there are only a couple of Bond films which the majority of the public would say is close to its level of quality. I mentioned in my last review that From Russia with Love was the favorite of many Bond alumni. Well, if there was someone prominent to the franchise that I didn't name there, then that's because their favorite film is most likely Goldfinger. Fans of this one are quite passionate in their adoration, and they're not wrong to be so praiseworthy. I write all of that to say this. I have a few personal nitpicks with it that hold it back from being in my top 5 of the series, but that doesn't mean that I don't love the film as well. Now, just because these are things that bother me, I don't want anyone to take my opinions too personally or to feel like these should bother them too. If you're still adamant that this is the best of the lot, that's fine. You're in good company. However, I would ask, would you mind making a little room for the rest of us in the fandom that just happen to like some of the other films more? Now let's get on with the story. After a mission in an undisclosed Latin America country, James Bond is relaxing in Miami when his old pal Felix Leiter comes to him with an assignment from M. Bond is to observe a man of interest named Auric Goldfinger, who is a legitimate bullion dealer and jeweler. Bond catches Goldfinger cheating at a card game and foils his scheme using his lady friend Jill Masterson. Goldfinger retaliates by having his henchman Oddjob knock Bond out and kill Jill by painting her head to toe in gold paint. When Bond returns to England, he demands an explanation from M as to what this is all about. Goldfinger is suspected to be engaging in some smuggling, and the government can't figure out how he's doing it. Bond shadows the man, first to a golf course, and then to his factory in Switzerland. As Bond observes Goldfinger at the factory, he overhears mention of something that seems to overshadow the smuggling called Operation Grand Slam. Bond now has to figure out what Grand Slam is and how to stop it without getting killed in the process. Goldfinger is a fairly straight-down-the-line adventure film. It's incredibly tight in its pacing, sharp in its dialogue, marvelous in its performances almost across the board, and spectacular in its imagination. One example of that is Operation Grand Slam. It's an ingenious villain scheme that improves on the source material. In the novel, Goldfinger simply intended to rob Fort Knox. In the film, Bond calls out some of the real-life problems Goldfinger would face if that's his intention, and he simply responds, "Who mentioned anything about removing it?" Bond puts the pieces together to figure out that Goldfinger intends to blow up Fort Knox with a nuclear device, so that whatever gold is left is irradiated for 58 years. Now, it ultimately accomplishes the same end goal as the book. Goldfinger gets richer as a result, and thus this is one of the films I point to when people try to argue that the book is always better than the movie. On my most recent viewing, which was done immediately prior to writing this review, I noticed a thematic idea that permeates this film that I never noticed before. James Bond has many skills and traits that are assets to him in the series, but this film displays one of them in a way that no other film does: his intelligence. Bond never actually defeats Goldfinger in the most permanent way, he just outwits him every time. He uses Jill to put an end to his cheating at cards. He uses a decoy ball to beat him at his own game. He plays on Goldfinger's sense of caution to get out of the laser trap, and he charms Pussy Galore into switching sides at the end. In fact, it's only due to his own carelessness that Goldfinger is killed at the end. Whenever Bond tries to brute force his way around Goldfinger or use one of his gadgets, it fails. He wrecks the Aston Martin at the factory, he fails to get the CIA's help with his homing gadget, he gets his butt handed to him by Oddjob at Fort Knox, and he might have gotten himself blown up if he tried tearing out the wires in the bomb. This idea helps to keep Bond feeling grounded and believable. Too often in the series, the get-out-of-jail-free card can feel too easy and cheap. I'm not going to name any specifics because it's always a case-by-case basis with the films rather than a universal issue. But when you combine all of them together in the series, you get the impression that Bond has a gadget for almost every situation, or can fight his way out. And thus any suspense may get lost because the audience is a step ahead of the film in knowing how the hero's going to get out of the situation. I think Guy Hamilton was smart in emphasizing Bond's intelligence for this outing. This is doubly fascinating for me to discover this time out, because I've often heard Goldfinger get singled out as the film where Bond starts to overly rely on technology. I think you'll find as you go through the film that Bond's tech actually fails to get him out of a situation more often than not. Sean Connery has been magnificent in the past two films, but this outing is something else entirely. With each successive entry, Connery seems to be moving further and further away from Fleming's original creation. I think anyone would be hard-pressed to say that Goldfinger is Connery's most Fleming-like effort, and yet most of those same people would say that this is his best performance, and I would be in that same camp. He leans more into his natural charisma rather than playing Bond as Fleming wrote it, and I'm weirdly okay with that despite my general preference for the films that lean closer into Fleming's own sensibilities. He's so comfortable in this role now that he hardly misses a beat, and no other actor could command this film like he does. He's the definition of debonair here. It's one of the towering performances in this series, and while I still prefer some of the other actors as Bond, this performance is just hard to beat. I also want to take a moment to discuss something that I don't think I ever really picked up on until marathoning this series, and that's Bond's attitude towards death. Usually Bond isn't glib about death when it comes to his friends and allies. He seems to have a solemn respect towards the death of people like Karen Bay, Paula, Aki, and Tilly. It kind of reminds me of that moment in Assassin's Creed 2 where Ezio is admonished by his uncle to treat death with some dignity. I love how Connery will take a moment to mourn the dead, and that helps to remind the audience that Bond's job often involves the highest of stakes. Pretty much all of the succeeding actors have scenes where they take a moment over the corpse of a friend or loved one to give them a last goodbye, and I think we can credit Connery for introducing that character trait. I've done several ranking lists so far for various categories of the series, and with each of the character-based ones, Goldfinger's cast tends to be towards the top. Gert Frobe is my favorite villain of the series, and that's thanks both to the physical performance and Michael Collins' vocal dubbing. They blend together so well that I still get comments to this day from people who don't even realize that that actually isn't the man's voice. My top 3 favorite moments with him are the laser scene, the scene with him and Bond on the porch that I discussed earlier, and the little exchange that they have next to his Rolls Royce. He mixes both charm and menace in equal measure, and I feel like he's never overshadowed by Connery. It's such a great pairing, and it needed to be. Screenwriter Richard Maybaum describes this film as a duel, and a duel is only as interesting as its combatants. This film presents us both with one of the best Bond performances, and also, for my money, the best villain, and it's thrilling to watch them face off against each other. Maybe it's just me, but I never quite picked up on the tension in the golf scene until I was older. It's pretty clear from the beginning that Goldfinger knows who Bond is still playing plausible deniability, and yet Goldfinger is only humoring Bond so long as he personally has something to gain from it. Sure, Oddjob's hat at the end is a bit over the top, but in the moment, I'm not thinking about it because the performances are sucking me into the drama of the situation. Harold Sakata makes for one of the best henchmen as well. Because his acting is all physical, there's no question from the start that Bond will have a tough time defeating him, and I love that the final scene with him circumvents our expectations. Bond can't beat him with physical might. He gets thrown around like it's nothing, and his best hits do nothing to Oddjob. It's only when using an electrical current that Bond can defeat him. That fight, by the way, plays out in an almost acoustic silence, and it's kinda chilling. Pussy Galore is the best Bond woman of the Connery era. While Connery's Bond has more meaningful relationships with some of the others, no one pairs with him quite like Honor Blackman. Their dynamic is so fun, and I just eat up every scene with them. I don't think they actually fall for each other really on a deep emotional level, but it's a solar flare of chemistry that's hard not to enjoy. Now, there's just one thing I wish they had done differently with these two. I've talked about this in several other videos, and I think this is the biggest misstep the film makes. If you know what I'm talking about and you don't really want to hear a better explanation as to why this bit bothers me, feel free to skip ahead. I won't hold it against you. Several people still express disappointment bordering on rage that I have a problem with the barn scene with Connery and Blackman. Before I explain my issue, let me just say that everything about this scene besides the final shot works for me. This is their best scene together. It's a crucial moment in the story of the film, and I love them throwing each other around in the hay using judo. This scene is meant to illustrate Bond using his charms to win over Galore since his attempt to contact the CIA failed. And given that Bond using his wits is a major theme of the film, it makes perfect sense to me. However, that last shot of Bond pushing himself down on her makes it look too much like a man forces himself upon a woman, and it makes me extremely uncomfortable. I get that this is not what the filmmakers are going for. This is meant to be a fantasy where the hero can seduce any woman with his animal-like charm, and there's definitely some wish fulfillment going on here. Heck, I can even buy that Galore dresses up this way intentionally to be provocative, so there is some initial consent. But the way in which she is trying to get out from under him makes me momentarily wonder if she is resisting him in a way that signifies she is withdrawing that consent. It's just that single shot that ruins it for me. I think the solution to this is very simple. Change the final shot. Now here's my idea. Instead of having Bond force himself down on her, maybe have her in his arms and have her hesitate before going in for a kiss. That hesitation would still be vague enough to keep the suspense of whether she has switched sides or if she is just compelled by him to have sex. That way you still get the rest of the scene as is, Bond still shows that magnetic charm that compels her, and the final shot wouldn't be undermining the idea that Bond wins through his intelligence and wit. Now that's just my suggestion, and there are undoubtedly others. Now that I've gotten off my soapbox, let's continue. Ken Adam is my favorite production designer of these films. While his vision may have been horribly expensive, I think it was worth that expense if only for the imagination. The Fort Knox set in particular is astounding. I'm not sure if this is my favorite film design-wise, but it's certainly up there. This is also one of my favorites in the series sound design-wise. Now when I talk about sound design, I don't necessarily mean music, although music is part of that package. Norman Winstall uses exaggerated sound effects throughout the film. They're not cartoony, but they're very overpronounced, and that helps to heighten the reality of the film. I think the mandate for this outing was entertainment at the expense of realism, and thus the choice of the sound effects here is in perfect marriage with the director's vision. No wonder Winstall was the first to win an Oscar for this series. I also cannot pass up the opportunity to talk about Q here. Desmond Llewellyn returns from the previous film and cements himself as the best Q of the series. His performance in From Russia with Love was mostly the same as Peter Burton's in Dr. No, but I liked the choice of Desmond there due to his face being a bit more animated than Peter's. Thankfully, the character of Q comes alive in this installment, and that's thanks to Hamilton's direction to Llewellyn. By making Q annoyed with Bond and his disrespect for the gadgets, it makes these scenes pull double duty. They provide the necessary info dumps about Bond's toolset, and they continue this idea of having fun. Without this direction, I doubt most people would cite the gadget showcases as highlights of the series. I think alongside License to Kill, GoldenEye, and The World Is Not Enough, this film contains some of my favorite bits of Q. And now, the Aston Martin DB5. This just might be the sexiest inanimate object I have ever seen. How can anyone watch this film and not want to own one of these? A great-looking sports car with fun gadgets like an ejector seat, revolving license plates, rear bulletproof screen, oil slick, machine guns, and tire-slashing spikes? Yes, please. Sure, other vehicles like the many incarnations of the Batmobile, the DeLorean, and Kit from Knight Rider might have their fans, but the Bond cars are my pick for the best vehicles in film and television. At some point, I'm sure I'll get around to doing a ranking of all the Bond cars in the series, but expect the DB5 to be in the top 3, if not at the very top of that list. It's such a brand unto itself and an icon that it cemented itself as Bond's personal car. Every time it comes back, I get excited, though that's not as often as a casual fan might think. In fact, it wouldn't be until No Time to Die that we got a full-blown gadget-laden chase with the DB5 again. I don't own a lot of memorabilia of Bond, but one of the few things I own is a die-cast of the DB5, and alongside my Walther PPK, it's my favorite piece of Bond memorabilia that I own. John Barry's music is really good, with my favorite piece being the laser scene. However, I've never personally placed the whole effort above many of the other scores in the series. It's not that it does anything particularly wrong, it's just never been amongst my favorites. Part of that could be that I don't care for the mixing of the orchestra. It could be the screeching brass, or it could be something else entirely. I'm not even entirely sure that I could effectively defend my choice in a debate scenario. The best analogy I can think of to explain my feelings is to equate the score with something like garlic parmesan chicken wings. Those are really good, and I'll usually eat them if offered, but when I'm ordering something for myself, I'll go for something like barbecue or teriyaki wings. Same thing here with Goldfinger. When I go for a John Barry score, I'd rather go for The Living Daylights, or From Russia with Love, or On Her Majesty's Secret Service, or heck, even Octopussy. But Goldfinger is a perfectly fine score. I don't have too many criticisms about it. It's just never been a favorite. Let's move on to a few more of the criticisms I have. The editing for this film is a real mixed bag. It's not the pacing I take issue with, it's just certain sequences. Sections like the laser sequence, the chase at Auric Enterprises, and the golf game are standouts, but there are other moments like the pre-title sequence and the raid at Fort Knox that feel a bit off to me. For example, in the pre-title sequence, Bond shoots a rope over a wall, we see a guard react to it, and then Bond is suddenly down upon the guy and kicks him in the face. If you think about the geography of the sequence and the timing it would take for some guy to climb over the wall, how is Bond able to do that and land on top of the guy without the guard reacting to Bond climbing over the top of the wall? Another example is Fort Knox. There's a bit towards the end with Leiter and the other agents coming down the stairs. We have a close-up on Bond's face and can see some guys run towards the stairwell behind him, which I feel like I could identify one of them as being Leiter. Then we'll see Leiter with the same guys entering the vault a little later. All the while, the bomb is counting down the seconds and will eventually stop at 7. Haha, very clever. As I'm trying to play this out in my head, while thinking back to how long it took Oddjob to get down those same stairs, I'm just not seeing how the guy that switches off the bomb could get down there that fast. Also, am I the only one that feels like the air raid and seeing the trucks drive through a desolated Fort Knox takes a bit too long? I like most of the locations, but I have mixed feelings about Kentucky. I get that the film needs to be there given that Fort Knox is actually located there, but it just doesn't have the same appeal for me as going to places like Switzerland or England. I've said before that I'm generally not a fan of putting Bond in America. There are definitely some films that make a good case for it, like Live and Let Die and Diamonds Are Forever. However, I generally like my Bond traveling to someplace more upper class and exotic, like Paris or Tokyo or Cairo or Venice. Kentucky just feels a little out of place with that lineup. I don't know, maybe I'm making too big of a deal about it. I also think the character of Tilly Masterson does not fit very naturally into this story. As far as I can tell, she is here for two reasons. The first is to ensure that Bond gets captured at Auric Enterprises, and the second is to have another hot girl in the movie. She doesn't really contribute to the story beyond her interferences, which lead to an action scene. Several Bond pictures have a problem with superfluous side Bond girls, but I think the Connery era may have some of the worst offenders. When writing You Only Live Twice, screenwriter Roald Dahl talked about how the producers like to have 3 Bond women per picture as a somewhat arbitrary formula, and I think that idea may have gotten started with this film. Goldfinger set forth the standard in the public's mind for the rest of the series to reach. Connery became a megastar, and spy mania really took hold. In 1966 alone, there were over 20 different films inspired by the Bond series. But the legacy of the film isn't just limited to the 1960s. Oh no. In 2001, the American Film Institute included Goldfinger in its top 100 most exciting movies of all time, which was the only Bond film to be honored with that distinction. In 1999, the film was given a similar honor by the British Film Institute, though Dr. No was also included on that list. Even today, Goldfinger consecutively tops more fan-ranking lists of the series than any other single entry. Suffice to say, Dr. No and From Russia with Love had been laying the foundation for a phenomenon, and Goldfinger hugely benefited from that buildup, and not only lived up to it, but surpassed expectations for most audiences. There's a bit of a debate in film circles about which film constitutes the first true blockbuster. Most would cite the original Jaws, but I would argue that there were precedents even before that, and Goldfinger is one of those. As for me, I think this film is terrific. It's never been my favorite of the series, nor is it even my favorite Connery outing, but it's a film that I respect and enjoy rewatching. In fact, the 2 most recent viewings I did for the purposes of this review were the most I ever enjoyed the film. Yet no Bond film is perfect, and I have just a few things that I don't care for here. But I would completely understand if someone chose this hill to die on. I much prefer the tone of something like From Russia with Love or For Your Eyes Only, the character depth of something like Casino Royale 2006 or On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and the thrills of something like GoldenEye or License to Kill. Yet for pure escapist entertainment, there are few Bond films that hold a candle to Goldfinger, and that's something I could use every so often in my palette. Sean Connery was on a winning streak with his films, and each one seemed to do better than the last. But how long could that success hold out?
Your name's James Bond.
You've been admiring my form.
With the success of the first 3 James Bond films with Sean Connery, it seemed clear that Eon Productions had a phenomenon on their hands. The next film was going to have an easy time at the box office thanks to Goldfinger being a blockbuster, as people seemed to be salivating for more adventures. And the producer's choice for this 4th outing was a story that seemed destined for movie screens, yet never seemed to escape its legal complications: Thunderball. Thunderball has a fascinating history, both before and after the film's release. This and Casino Royale are the books with the most interesting journeys from page to screen, and we'll tackle a little bit of Royale's journey next time. Many of you likely know that Ian Fleming had always wanted to see his hero make the leap to the big screen. Thunderball was a story that came out of several meetings in 1958 between Fleming, a young Irish producer named Kevin McClory, and a few friends of theirs. Over the next year, there were at least 10 different versions of the story, encompassing outlines, treatments, and scripts. By the fall of 1959, Fleming became disenchanted with the process, and McClory in particular, because of the release of his most recent film. And so McClory brought in a friend named Jack Whittingham to help continue the writing process. Fleming eventually wrote a novel based on these treatments called Thunderball. McClory read an advanced copy of the book and rightly sued Fleming for not acknowledging his and Whittingham's contributions. As a result of this legal action, McClory gained the rights for the screenplay version, as well as any other future filmed versions of the story, and Fleming retained the rights to the novel. Had this suit not happened, Thunderball would have likely been the first James Bond film. With the film rights to the James Bond novels now split between several different parties, Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman were the first ones to get a film out, and thus we have Dr. No. With Thunderball in the hands of Kevin McClory, and Casino Royale in the hands of Charles K. Feldman, Eon Productions faced two potential rivals at the box office. Originally, Broccoli and Saltzman were pursuing a deal with Feldman to get that book made, but after Fleming's death in 1964, Broccoli and Saltzman also started talking to McClory and were able to come to a deal with him instead of Feldman. Thus, even though early prints of Goldfinger promised that the next film was going to be On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Thunderball preempted that plan, and it now stands as the fourth cinematic Bond adventure. We'll touch on more of the legal troubles and aftermath of this film if we ever get around to talking about the remake, Never Say Never Again. The story is as follows. Spectre is on the verge of their biggest scheme yet: hijack 2 atomic warheads and hold the West hostage for $280 million, or £100 million. James Bond is actually at the health clinic near the airbase where the bombs are stationed at, and finds the body of a Major Derval the night of the theft. In the briefing the next day at MI6, Bond notes that Major Derval is part of the flight crew carrying the bombs, despite the fact that Bond found the corpse before the theft. He asks M to allow him to pursue Derval's sister, Domino, as part of his investigation. Domino is currently in Nassau, and is a ward to Emilio Largo, the man overseeing the Spectre operation. Bond now has less than 4 days to find the bombs and stop Spectre. The Spectre plot has since become a template plan for various other adventures and spy spoofs, but I think it's a solid enough scheme for an early Bond adventure. It provides some great tension for the film, and it's easy to understand. This film has been criticized for a few things related to this plot. It takes too long to get going, and a lot of the action is underwater, which slows that action down and robs some of the excitement. I won't disagree with these points entirely. I think they're valid complaints. I'm tackling them together because I think both are casualties of the same problem: length. The theft feels like it's showing us every step of the scheme, regardless of how important it is to see each stage, and the underwater scenes sometimes have prolonged shots or even sometimes unnecessary insert shots of aquatic life. I think the solution is obvious: conciseness. For example, instead of showing bits like covering the Vulcan with the net, have Largo sum up those parts in his phone report to Blofeld. I feel like the audience would be smart enough to connect the dots and understand certain things like the bombs have been taken from the plane without actually showing that bit. As for the other underwater sequences, I have mixed feelings. Bits like the final battle at Miami feel like they go on a bit too long, and yet moments like Bond fighting the guy outside the Disco Volante and Bond being discovered by Largo at the bomb site are perfectly fine. A lot of that may be the music playing behind it, but I just wanted to point out that I don't think the fact that a lot of the action is underwater is a mistake. I think it's just a pacing and editing problem. Later films like The Spy Who Loved Me and License to Kill prove that underwater sequences can be done just as well as any other kind of action sequence, so I don't think McClory's weird fascination with aquatic scenes is necessarily the problem. Beyond the underwater bits, I just have a great time watching this film. I've described Thunderball in the past as feeling like we get to go on vacation with Bond, and I stand by that. There's just something about the Bahamas that screams luxury and fun, which are definitely part of the Bond cocktail. It's beautifully photographed in a widescreen 2:35:1 ratio, the first for the series, by the way. And since my initial viewing of the film, I've always wanted to travel there. I think the series has a similar attitude to the location that I do, since it's revisited the Bahamas several times, both as a practical shooting location and as an actual location in a story. Casino Royale in 2006 even has Bond in similar settings, and I think that's a testament to how much Bond is identified with the place. The music helps to cement this idea of going on vacation. John Barry's score exudes that same elegance with all the style of 007 himself. This, along with some of the pieces from Diamonds Are Forever, is what I would imagine the classic Bond's world would sound like if there was an actual orchestra playing in the background. The title track is a step up from Goldfinger's offering. Now, not to crap on that song, I think it's a great song actually, but Thunderball feels like it's a better fit for Connery's interpretation of the character. It's a little more dark and dangerous. Because the film's post-production was insanely short, the song was not available for Barry to use throughout much of the scoring process, and so we have Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang as our main tune for much of the major sequences. I really love this song as well, and I think it would have been a fine tune to carry the entirety of the score if we didn't have Tom Jones's offering. Much like some of the later films, Thunderball is a film that has two main songs that both would have served as excellent title songs, and I'm so happy I live in a world where the film has both. The performances from the cast are generally solid. Sean Connery started to get a bit bored and frustrated both by the insane publicity and the lack of complexity of Bond's character by this point, but thankfully I think he's able to put these problems aside and give us one more solid performance as Bond. My favorite bit with him is when he and Largo do some skeet shooting. The way he just casually shoots the target out of the air is so friggin' cool and hilarious in equal measure that I can't help but love it. In fact, this might be my single favorite Connery moment in any of the films. I've already raved about Domino in the past, so I'll just sum up my opinions here. She's a great layered character. A kept woman who's resigned to her lot in life, that becomes intrigued by all that Bond has to offer, and her desire for revenge against Largo for killing her brother adds a much-needed edge to that character. I love all of her scenes, but my favorite is when she kills Largo. Director Terrence Young was smart not to cut to Largo's reaction, as it seems to give that moment more significance for Domino as a character, and I think it's more powerful. Emilio Largo is a fine villain who's supposed to be a mirror for Bond, and I love the comparison-contrast that's done between them. However, I feel like the series has offered us better examples of how to do the darker side of Bond character, like Red Grant, Franz Sanchez, Alec Trevelyan, and Le Chiffre. And thus Largo loses a bit of that fascination he might have had with me at the time. I do like some of the unique things he brings to the table, like his ruthless streak and his treatment of Domino, but I struggle to find too many other reasons to bump him higher in my rankings. The best villain in this film is Fiona Volpe. She is just so much fun. She's got both the sexuality and the deviousness that I want from my femme fatales. Much like her namesake, her wily nature makes it a treat to pit her against a predator like Bond. She is a deliberate response to characters like Tatiana Romanova and Pussy Galore who were won over to Bond's side, and her dialogue during the scene where Bond is captured is my second favorite bit of the film. Although I also love the earlier gag with her in the tub and Bond handing her shoes to put on. The main issue this film has with its characters is in its overabundance of side characters. So many minor parts are given names and are built up to be important parts of the villain's organization, and yet I struggle to remember most of them once the film is over. The bad guys have Vargas, Quist, Yanni, Kutz, Count Lippi, and Angelo, though I do tend to remember Lippi and Angelo more because they have larger parts towards the beginning. The one thing Vargas gets is a cool death, and that's about it. The film even comments on the lack of memorability of some of these characters when Largo asks, "What do you do, Vargas?" My answer, get a life. The good guys don't fare much better. I do like bringing Felix Leiter back, and I do appreciate that this film is trying to treat this mission as an all-hands-on-deck affair, so it makes sense that Bond has some other allies palling around with him. Yet Pinder is someone I forget about when the film is over, and right now, I don't recall there being an analogous version of him in Never Say Never Again. Paula fares a little better, but it feels like she's just here to be kidnapped and killed, so I don't really get the point of her prominence in the film, beyond the obvious marketing move to try to get as many Bond girls in this outing as possible. Speaking of Bond women, Patricia Faring is a pretty memorable secondary character. I think it's mostly because of Bond blackmailing her into sex. While this probably should present a problem for me like the barn scene in Goldfinger, I'm actually okay with this one, mostly because it's much clearer that Pat is as into the idea as Bond is, and so it comes off as playful banter. I don't think Bond would have actually made her lose her job if she refused to have sex with him. I think it's just part of the game. And besides, it's totally within Bond's character to shag his way into a clean bill of health, and he's done this several times, most notably in GoldenEye with Caroline, Dr. Molly Warmflash in The World Is Not Enough, and with the other version of Patricia Faring in Never Say Never Again. Let's touch on some production points. I love the idea of bringing back Terrence Young for this outing, but there's something about this film that feels closer in spirit to Goldfinger than something like From Russia with Love. I think it's specifically because Young wants to upstage Guy Hamilton, and he's admitted to as such in interviews. I credit Terrence Young a lot in establishing the basic building blocks of a Bond film, and I think this is a fine film for him to exit on. Ken Adam once again does fine work, particularly with the underwater craft and the Spectre meeting room, but that is to be expected by now. If you can, I'd highly recommend watching the film with the commentaries on. In preparation for the Special Edition and Ultimate Edition DVD releases of the series, John Cork put together some fabulous bonus material. Thunderball specifically has 2 commentaries, and one of them highlighted Ken Adams' design work. If you look at the 2 briefing room scenes, there are a number of wonderful details that invite comparison. For example, both Bond and Largo are the last ones to enter the room, and will be the focal points of our story. Both of the rooms have large maps with areas highlighted. MI6's room has a high ceiling and uses a very warm color palette, representing the just side of the law. Spectre has a very low ceiling and uses dark and cold colors, representing the cloistered nature of Spectre and the villainy inherent within. Having taught design work at a few universities myself, those are the kinds of details that, if a student came to me with those ideas in mind, would make me beam with pride. The title sequence is my favorite in all of the Connery films. Maurice Binder returns after a 2-film absence, and much like Young wanting to upstage Hamilton in directing, I think Binder wants to top Brown John's work, and I think he succeeds. Everything traditional we love about Bond sequences can be traced back to this film, and I love a lot of the specific imagery. Women swimming, villains shooting harpoons, the specific color palette, it's all great stuff. The pre-title sequence is a terrific follow-up to Goldfinger's standout template. The jetpack does feel a little out of place, but it's worth it for how cool it is. I also adore the fight scene with Bob Simmons, and he finally gets to play a named character. I also love the gag of Bond punching a widow, though I think his discovery of Bouvard's deception at the funeral is pretty weak. The film also relies a bit too much on coincidence in its plotting for its own good. Bond just happens to be at the same health clinic that Spectre is using as part of their plot. Fiona Volpe just happens to be the one that picks up Bond on the side of the road. A shark just happens to escape the net of the Vulcan plane at the same time that Bond is checking it out so he can get inside. You see what I mean? There are also a few odd moments here and there. During the Q briefing, Q specifically states that the watch has the Geiger counter. Yet Bond gives Domino the camera saying it also has a counter. I suppose they both could have had it, but I wish it was mentioned during that earlier scene. As Largo and Domino are leaving the casino, Leiter and Bond are seen chatting with each other in the background. Yet Leiter enters Bond's hotel room and treats it like it's the first time they're meeting up. There's a guy that comes into the final fight with Bond and Largo, and he's holding a plate of champagne. What? Largo and crew were going to celebrate getting away from the Navy before they fully managed to do that? Also, how does this guy not hear or see the ruckus going on upstairs? There are also some clear smudges on the camera lens during the skeet shooting scene with Volpe and Largo on the Blu-ray transfer I watched in preparation for this review. This is one of the only times I've noticed something like that I feel like could have been fixed during the Lowry restoration project in the mid-2000s. Is this the only official film since Dr. No that doesn't include some version of the phrase James Bond will return? Finally, I want to comment on the humor. Connery's films have always had their sense of humor, but I think this film has the best collection of jokes and gags. I've already mentioned a few of them so far, but just watch Connery giving his one-liners in this one, and I think you'll see what I mean. Thunderball oozes style for me. While the previous 3 films are all better in my eyes, this is the film that comes to mind when I think of Sean Connery at the height of his popularity. It has stunning locations, great design work, fabulous Bond women, a devious Spectre plan, and a fantastic score. I can understand where detractors of this film are coming from, but I can't say I agree that these problems outweigh the good. Thunderball did indeed take advantage of the hype built by the previous films. Before Skyfall, this was the highest grossing film of the series, adjusted for inflation, of course. Despite its popularity, this film caused a fair amount of problems for the series to follow. Connery started to rethink his commitment to the series, and this would not be the last we'll see of McClory's insistence in getting involved in the James Bond films. The shadow the first 4 Connery films cast on cinema in general was quite large at the time, and plenty of other studios looked for some way to get in on that trend, and we'll take a look at one of these efforts to cash in on the spy craze next time.
James Bond. Allow me to introduce myself.
In my mind, endings are the hardest parts of a story to come up with. Of course, that's not always the case, but generally, a suitable climax that ties everything together and is a satisfying payoff is extremely tough to pull off, especially when you have so many moving pieces to a story and have been building in tension and excitement over multiple installments. Most modern film franchises like to limit their stories to a more manageable 3 to 4 film arc. But in the case of an open-ended series like the Bond franchise, there was no intention of stopping in the single digits as long as there was an audience for it. You Only Live Twice was never intended to be the final Bond film, and yet I find many aspects about it that suggest it could have served as an ending for the Bond series if the producers deemed it so. James Bond dies, James Bond gets married, James Bond finally meets Ernst Stavro Blofeld, the head of Spectre, an organization that we had set up all the way back in Dr. No. The villain's scheme involves the conquest of space that will ignite a new world war. Plus, there's the sad note that Sean Connery had decided he was fed up with the character and the series, and he announced during production that this would be his last film. Last film at the time, anyways. Given how much of the popularity of the Bond character was tied to its leading man, many wondered if this would signal the demise of the films. Obviously, that was not the case, but it cannot be overstated how important Connery was to the success of the films in the minds of the public. Heck, even today, there are many fans who feel as though the series never reached the heights of the Connery era, despite several acclaimed efforts afterwards. Production of this film was a troublesome one from the start. Even during the shooting of Thunderball, Connery had been making moves to either try and get out of the series or to be allowed a bit more freedom as an actor. He was under contract for 6 films, but despite Cubby and Harry's attempts to placate their star, he felt like now was a good exit point. So I think the producers wanted to go all out with this one, not only to showcase the star while they still had him, but also to take advantage of the massive success that Thunderball was. An unknown power has kidnapped a space capsule from the United States while on orbit. The US is quick to blame Russia, while Russia aggressively denies their claim. The British government doesn't seem to concur with its ally, positing the idea that the kidnapping craft landed somewhere in Japan. James Bond is selected to investigate the disappearance, but due to the delicacy of the mission, Bond is seemingly killed off so that his enemies will drop their guard a bit and inadvertently allow him some breathing room to investigate. Upon his arrival in Japan, he quickly finds the claim to be correct, but that it isn't Japan that's committing the thefts. It soon becomes evident that Spectre is back, looking to start a war between the East and the West for its own purposes, and that Number 1 is personally overseeing the operation. With less than 3 weeks to work the case, Bond has to navigate the unfamiliar world of Japan in order to stop a horrifying plan with the highest of stakes. You Only Live Twice marks the beginning of the diversion from the purer adaptations to much looser works that feature aspects of the titular book. Not that the previous 4 films didn't also make large departures from the source material from time to time, but this one abandons the novel's plot about decoding machines and poison gardens in order to try and top Thunderball in scale. Instead of holding the world hostage, we now see Bond stopping a global war that even includes the arena of outer space. Honestly, the switch-up makes perfect sense to me. The book was very much a sequel to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and had the emotional crux hinge on Bond getting revenge for Tracy's death. For the film series, we had been more or less dealing with the films as standalone outings, with small elements weaving in and out for fans. Yet there are still parts of the book that make it into the film. The characters of Tiger Tanaka, Henderson, and Kissy Suzuki, Bond's fake death, and Bond identifying as a Japanese fisherman are all present in some form. The film also doesn't focus as much on death and endings as the book does, which also was a good move, as it would have been an incredibly downbeat way to say goodbye to Connery. That said, the plot really doesn't feel that unique. It's a grander version of Dr. No's basic plot, mixed in with some elements of Thunderball. Now, I'm usually not a stickler for originality in films' plots, especially with an action series like this one. But it still seems a bit too soon for the series to start recycling ideas like this. The Fleming books all had different kinds of stories for the longest time, and given that the next film features one of the more unique plots in the series, I'm a bit surprised that the well is seeming to dry up this early. Part of this issue could be with the writer Roald Dahl. I love Dahl's original works, and he has a vivid imagination. However, Dahl admitted that he was not a fan of the original novel and was running a little low on inspiration at this time, hence going back to Dr. No. I still think he does an alright job with some of the individual lines here and there, but I have to wonder if he was the right choice to pen this adventure. Let me cite a few examples. I love the idea of Bond faking his own death so that he can operate more covertly, but I don't feel like this idea is present enough in the final film. Bond doesn't really go about his investigation that much differently to how he went about his other assignments, and Blofeld figures out pretty quickly that Bond is alive. Sure, he goes undercover as a Japanese fisherman in order to hide in plain sight, but A, this happens before Blofeld sends the two guys to the ninja school to kill him, so the disguise seems to be pointless in concealing him from Spectre's eyes, and B, who in their right mind would buy this incarnation of Bond as a Japanese fisherman? I'm also quite intrigued with the idea of Bond training to become a ninja, but other than a throwing star and some suction cups, he surprisingly demonstrates very little different about his usual skill set in the finale, so the potential is wasted to me. I get that Dahl's hands were tied by the producers on this next issue. One of their few stipulations was that the film needed to have 3 Bond women, but I would really love to hear them making that solid argument against merging Aki and Kissy into one character. Even if you had to kill off Aki for some reason in the middle of the film, maybe to raise the personal stakes for Bond, the film seems to almost forget about Aki immediately. Plus, wouldn't it have been cool for the producers to allow Bond to really be emotionally affected by that death, so that you could have retained some of the emotional stakes from the book, where Bond now has a personal reason to hate Blofeld, and the climax could feel even more layered? These, along with a few other minor inconsistencies that I'll get to a little later, demonstrate for me that the writing is a little sloppier this time around, and that's a little hard to overlook. Let's move on to the cast. This is definitely Sean Connery's worst performance as James Bond. As will become clear when we tackle Diamonds Are Forever, I'm of the opinion that in the official series, Connery is the only actor to do more than 2 films that never had a bad film. But that distinction does not extend to his performances. He seems to be sleepwalking his way through this film without injecting much of the magic he had in his previous 4 films. I'm honestly shocked how obvious it is from much of the footage that he is just here to earn a paycheck. It doesn't reach the Jennifer Lawrence level of I don't want to be here acting, but it's far closer to that than it should be. He does still have a few good moments throughout. I love his delivery of the reply to Helga Brandt's healthy chest line, and there are a few moments towards the end in the Spectre layer where he seems to do fine. If I can be frank, I feel like part of the reason I have trouble connecting with this film is because the leading man isn't doing his job of guiding the audience. As much as the fandom, including myself, like to give George Lazenby crap for the next film, he at least is trying there and seems to want to sell each moment as a character, even if he doesn't have the acting chops to do it. Lazenby is invested in his film. Connery for this one is not. And while that's certainly understandable given the circumstances surrounding this film, it reeks of an unprofessional attitude that is generally uncharacteristic of Connery, and I think that's a big problem. The shining light in the cast is Donald Pleasance. He doesn't get much screen time, but he makes the most of it. The scar down the eye and the bald head were genius choices. He looks like a deformed monster clothed in civility, and it's strikingly memorable. The monotone voice occasionally gives way to an unnatural venomous yell, and it's genuinely unsettling. While I stand by my previous statements that Telly Savalas is my favorite incarnation of the character, Pleasance's Blofeld is the most iconic, and I do wish he had either another film to work on or more screen time here. He's a great payoff to this anticipation we have had over several films now to finally see Blofeld's face. The other villains range from good to mediocre. I think Helga is the best of the rest of them. She never stood out as much as I would have liked, but she also doesn't slouch in her few scenes. The sequence with her in 007 on the Ningpo is a classic Bondian setup with great payoff. She also gets a solid death scene, being eaten by piranhas for failing to kill Bond. One problem I have with her may be somewhat circumstantial. A common complaint of the Connery films at the time was that Bond could always bang a woman to the side of good. While I'm not saying I wanted Helga to switch sides, after Thunderball's deconstruction with Fiona Volpe and 1967's Casino Royale's exaggeration with Agent Mimi, I'm starting to get a little sick of being reminded that this was a common complaint at the time, which is honestly a criticism I never shared. I never really had that much of an opinion of Mr. Osato, which is why I substituted him for Hans in the Henchman ranking video. He doesn't make me cringe at any point, but he's not threatening, he's not colorful, the performance is merely a functional one, and so I often forget he exists. Hans actually leaves much more of an impact for me, but for a bad reason. He has no performance, and the payoff is not satisfying. He's a brute that never stands as much of a challenge for Bond as he should. Oddjob was also a mute brute, and yet I felt like there was so much personality coming from Harold Sakata's performance that he became a scene stealer. Later in the series, we would get Jaws, and he also showcases how to be an immovable object while also making an impression. Part of my disappointment with Hans could be somewhat circumstantial, like my complaint with Helga. We've now had 5 strong blonde henchmen in the series, and all of them are improvements. The only one we had before Hans at the time was Red Grant, which I placed at the top of my personal henchman ranking list, so you should know how I feel about the guy. Hans is a black spot for me in this villain lineup. Bond does have some solid companions to accompany him here. Tiger Tanaka is certainly one of the better Bond allies. I love that much like Karen Bay, he acts as a guide to a new culture, and the two of them have a genuine rapport. Aki is my favorite of the two good women. She's the first major Bond woman that's also a fellow agent, she's supremely competent, and shares some chemistry with Connery. I also like how mysterious she is portrayed towards the beginning. While she does seem to be an ally, there is a question about her loyalties, and I kinda dig that as a starting point for her character. Her death scene is also a favorite bit of the film for me. It's quiet and eerie with how quickly she passes. Plus, Bond gets to showcase his quiet reverence for the dead, which I feel like Connery was the best at playing that character trait. I do wonder why she and Bond are suddenly so into each other at the massage table, but I mostly let it slide because I do see why the two would be interested in each other. Unfortunately, Kissy Suzuki is a poor translation of an important Fleming character. She appears too late in the film to get that interested in her specifically, she's got an icy dynamic with Bond, and never gets a payoff moment to show how awesome she is. I get that Bond is a bit of a horn dog, and that's part of the character, but I wish there was a better reason for these two to get together than Bond making out with a woman on the water is how we end these films. Mie Hama delivers an alright performance, but the weakness of her character stands out too much for me, as does the dubbing. I've now seen 5 prominent Bond women in this series dubbed by Nikki Vandersil, 3 of whom were the lead Bond women in their respective films. And while she's a very talented performer whose voice usually matches the character, I'm starting to get a little sick of all the girls sounding the same. It probably stands out more here because I feel like this voice doesn't match the character. The issue with the dubbing is probably just a me thing though, and might not stand out as much if you watch this series out of order like I usually do. If the script and the cast don't grab me, most of the other production departments can. This is by far the best photographed of the early Bond films. Freddie Young, the veteran cinematographer from Lawrence of Arabia, one of the most memorably photographed films of all time, brings his talents to this entry. While it's not near that level of quality, some of my favorite things to look at are his landscape shots, utilizing the unique topography of Japan and the sun. It's absolutely gorgeous. He also displays a great sense of where to place the camera. I don't know if this is a random thing to call out, but camera placement can sometimes be a difficult choice to make when crafting visual art, and Young shows off his mastery here. For the most part, I'm never confused as to what I'm looking at or why. The action is benefited a lot by the visuals as well. One of my favorite shots is Bond running over a rooftop at the Kobe docks with the goons chasing after him. Most films would have you down on the ground with the action with some quick cutting, but Young gives us the fight just fine while allowing us to marvel at a unique type of shot. The aerial photography was aided by Johnny Jordan, who would return for the next film as well. Jordan's skill can best be showcased during the Little Nelly sequence. At first, we're just seeing great shots of Japan's landscapes and accompanied with a fine John Barry score, and so I'm just enjoying this slower paced section. Then the action ramps up into a great aerial battle with helicopters, and I love watching most of the shots knowing that someone was up there with the real flight craft. It is breathtaking. This film has somewhat shoddy visual effects. There are some rather obvious model shots, odd opticals, and dodgy rear projection. I'm not sure what's going on here, as most of the crew was the same that had just worked on the previous film, and Thunderball had won an Oscar for its visual effects. However, the same cannot be said for Ken Adams' design work. Once again, he delivers top-notch material with one of the most impressive sets ever designed for a Bond film, the Volcano layer. This thing is ridiculously huge and wonderful. With a monorail, a large open space for a ground battle, a crater door that slides open and allows for ninjas to rappel down, and a great-looking command center with a separate set that looks to be Blofeld's apartment. This is one of the best villain layers of the series, if not the best. The climax is just thrilling. Most of the film is lacking a certain lively energy for me, and man does it pick back up in the last 30 minutes. I also just love the choice to spend most of the film in one country. Japan is such a contrast to the other settings we had been doing previously, and it is no less exotic. The film spends a lot of time showcasing aspects of Japanese culture of the time, and while the wedding goes on a little long, I do enjoy other scenes like a sumo wrestling match or a ninja training school. I also think this is editor Peter Hunt's best effort in the films. Apparently, newcomer Lewis Gilbert brought in his regular editor Thelma Connell, who delivered an almost 3-hour cut of the film, but reaction was negative to it, so Hunt was brought back in. For his work here, he was finally granted permission to direct a film, and I think his work is deserving of that reward. You Only Live Twice is one of the leaner Bond films, running in at a little under 2 hours. And while some of the individual scenes overstay their welcome, the film overall never does, and I appreciate the effort. The opening act of this film has a great sense of mystery about it. The pre-title sequence is one of the few in the series not to center on a big show-stopping stunt or action set piece, but it instead establishes an atmosphere of deception and mistrust. As Bond travels to Japan, he feels like a stranger in a strange land and is wary of anyone he encounters. And it's not until he meets up with Tiger that this tension lets up. I actually wish this tone permeated a bit more of the film, and I think later entries like Live and Let Die and No Time to Die are also good examples of how to place Bond in unfamiliar settings and use that tension to drive the story. Some final disparate things I wanted to mention. John Barry uses a 4-note descending bass line that has the exact same notes as the main theme for the next film. Deco Henderson is weirdly a memorable bit part, partially because of the casting of Charles Gray, but also because of the death. He suddenly becomes quiet without any exhale of breath, and it's an effective moment. Another action scene that I love is the fight between the thug and Bond in Osato's office. There's something quite brutal about it, and I love the choreography. Little Nelly is quite possibly my favorite non-car Bond vehicle. It's deceptively inappropriate for a spy like 007, and yet she defends her honor well. I've gotten a lot of flack for not placing Nancy Sinatra's title song higher, and that flack is probably well-deserved. This is a beautiful song that makes for a lovely addition to the film, and I enjoyed it a bit more this time than I ever have. However, I still never find myself going back to it all that much, probably because the enigmatic nature of the song just doesn't compel me to come back for casual listens. It's kind of like watching a lot of the films from Francis Ford Coppola's or Stanley Kubrick's filmographies. I have to be in just the right mood for it. I feel like the best Bond songs for me have both fun and beauty at their core, and while this song has beauty in spades, I don't find it fun to listen to. And so outside of the context of this film, it's just never been one that I've gone back to that much. I'm pretty sure that's just a personal preference, so don't put too much stock into this observation if it is one of your favorites. Henderson asks Bond if he's been to Japan before, which Bond replies in the negative. Yet Bond had told Tanya back in From Russia with Love that he and M had an interesting experience in Tokyo. Where did Kissy's shirt go during the final battle? How does Bond not see this guy that knocks him out? Why isn't Bond suspicious when Helga wears a parachute and doesn't give him one? Bond pretends to be a Japanese man twice in this film. Why doesn't the driver realize he's picked up someone else? Who is the guy with the binoculars in the beginning? You Only Live Twice is a fairly impressive showcase of many of the best aspects of the James Bond series, and yet I find other parts of it to be, dare I say, a little by the numbers. I always thought this was the weakest of the first 5 films. It was always the Connery adventure I'd be least likely to want to watch from the official entries, and I could never figure out exactly why that was until I started digging into it and comparing it with the rest of the series. It's not a bad outing, far from it. It offers many things to enjoy, and in some ways is as iconic a Bond picture as you can find. Many of the production elements are amazing. Its incarnation of Blofeld was worth the 5-year wait to see. The Volcano layer is a standout even for this series, and I usually have a good time while watching it. Nevertheless, there are just so many other Bond films I'd rather watch before this one. I've said it before, but Bond films are like pizza. Even when they're not the best, they're still pretty good, and this film exemplifies that for me. You Only Live Twice unfortunately didn't do as well as the past films, either critically or commercially at the time. It was one of the lowest grossing of the series, second only to Dr. No, and with Sean Connery calling it quits, the series was thrust into a bit of a pickle. There clearly was still interest for more Bond productions, but how do you possibly follow on from one of the most popular leading men in action films and continue to take the series in a fresh direction narratively? The producers' response to this issue was shocking. Positively shocking.
My name is Bond. James Bond.
Diamonds are forever. They are all I need to please me. They can stimulate and tease me. They won't leave in the night. I've no fear that they might desert me.
When creating an ongoing film franchise, you'll sometimes end up with entries that fail to resonate with audiences at the box office. That's not necessarily a remark on the quality of the project, just that not every film is going to make the money you hope for. You then have two choices moving forward: take a risk or play it safe. For example, while many love it now, Temple of Doom was considered polarizing at the time, and so Steven Spielberg and George Lucas decided to play it safe for The Last Crusade, and that worked in their favor. I don't need to go into Lucas's other series, but that's another case where safe entries often came after risky ones, and sometimes that worked, and sometimes it backfired. Terminator, Star Trek, Alien, Iron Man, Planet of the Apes, Jurassic Park, Spider-Man, you name it. Virtually every franchise has had this quagmire at one point or another, and sometimes it happened a few times. After the lukewarm reception to On Her Majesty's Secret Service and George Lazenby's walkout, Cubby, Harry, and the United Artists found themselves in a bit of a pickle. They once again had no James Bond, but now they had the additional challenge of figuring out what to do with Majesty's ending. That film clearly paved the way for a follow-up to have a revenge-driven plot to pursue Blofeld, and yet it seemed at the time that the public might not be terribly interested in going that direction. Plus, Lazenby had failed to win over audiences with his portrayal, so Cubby and Harry set about trying to find a new Bond, and seemed to have found their man, John Gavin, who was actually signed and announced as the new Bond. However, United Artists weren't happy with the choice and were hell-bent on getting Sean Connery back. They managed to convince the actor to sign on for just one more film. The deal included the record-breaking sum of over $1 million, plus a percentage of the gross, and production backing for 2 films of Connery's choice. Now with Sean in place, the film seemed to come together, and it was clear that the producers had made up their mind at this point about what to do with Diamonds Are Forever. Let's play it safe. After seemingly dispatching Blofeld for good, James Bond is given a rather drab assignment following a smuggling operation through to its head. He starts by impersonating a smuggler named Peter Franks and meets with Tiffany Case, part of this pipeline. She is currently in possession of a large shipment of diamonds and is about to head to Las Vegas to pass them along. Under the guise of Franks, Bond goes with her and discovers that the trail seems to lead towards Willard White, an entrepreneur who has not been seen in person for 5 years. Upon further investigation, Bond discovers that it is actually a very much alive Blofeld operating in place of White and using his company as a cover for his operations. So with a diamond smuggling scheme on one hand and a renowned laser refraction scientist on the other, what could Blofeld possibly be up to now? I'll start off by acknowledging this film's reputation. For the general public, this is just another random Bond film, no different than something like Tomorrow Never Dies or The Man with the Golden Gun. It doesn't have a lot of notoriety about it, so I don't see many having strong opinions. However, amongst Bond fans, it's a different story. Diamonds is often a candidate for one of the weakest in the series, and I've often seen this film placed at the bottom of a lot of lists, alongside Die Another Day or some of Craig's outings. I have my theories as to why this is, and I'll get into those in a bit. But I would like to make it clear that while this is definitely one of the weaker films, I wouldn't call it terrible. In fact, I think it's about as low as you can go on the quality spectrum of Bond films before it becomes a film that I dislike. I think it has several merits, but it definitely has its deficiencies as well, and I can totally understand if this is a least favorite film in the series for you. I think the main reason it gets reviled is because of two aspects relating to its position within the franchise. It's the very next film after Majesties, and it's Connery's return to the official series. If you're a fan of Majesties like I am, then you were probably disappointed that such a rich storyline like Bond getting revenge on Blofeld for Tracy was dismissed in favor of a lighter tone that starts to skew towards broader comedy. If you didn't like Majesties, and were instead excited by Connery returning to the role, then you were probably disappointed that such a restrained adventure was the vessel for him that seems to be a world apart from the first 5 films. In that sense, I'd say Never Again is a more appropriate fit to market Connery's return to the role. Despite it being a remake, Never Again goes all out in places and makes sure that Connery's return is celebrated throughout. I think Diamonds works better as a standalone film divorced from those aspects and when taken as a standard lighter Bond adventure, but it is such a missed opportunity on either front, as well as not quite measuring up to the standard of quality that the series is known for, that it tends to dig such a pit for itself when compared to other Bond films. I also find it hard to forget that this is the last time that we'll see Blofeld in the official series until Spectre, with one exception. This rivalry has been built up since From Russia with Love, and arguably since Dr. No. If anyone is the official nemesis of 007, it's Blofeld, and we never got to fully pay off that mounting tension. Especially after they adapted On Her Majesty's Secret Service, I figured it would have been a given that the marriage would matter in future films. Apparently, Richard Maybaum did write a version of Diamonds where Bond went after Blofeld for Tracy's death, and I'm so sad to not live in a world where we got a satisfying payoff for that. As much as I love the pre-titles in For Your Eyes Only, I don't think that confrontation should have been relegated to an opening scene that's fairly disconnected from the rest of the movie's plot. I'm perfectly aware of the legal troubles that surrounded Blofeld, and that's why he's largely absent from the series after Connery's run, but I figured that would have only forced the producers to be aware of the ticking clock they had on the film rights to the character. I've spoken before about the producers' tendencies to tackle each of the entries as its own entity, and while I'm generally okay with that, Diamonds represents the biggest problem with that ideology. If audiences thought of Blofeld as the same man through each of these films, then some continuity is to be expected. By deciding to virtually ignore certain characters and events, the producers shot themselves in the foot. Again, this is somewhat okay for most of the films and if you're watching them out of order, but when films from the same series bring back a character for a story and expect you to bring over your investment from past outings, then I think it's only fair to expect that all of those adventures featuring the character should count. Can you imagine the confusion if you went into Star Trek 3 and Spock was alive right at the start and with the crew acting like nothing had happened to him? There certainly is more than a slight hint of the absurdity and camp that would sometimes rear its head during some of the later films. I've even heard this film called the first Roger Moore adventure, and I would agree with that entirely. Characters like Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, Plenty O'Toole, Bambi and Thumper, and Mrs. Whistler seem like they would be more at home in a film like Octopussy or Moonraker than something from the Connery era. The police chase, the dune buggy, some bits at Circus Circus, and Blofeld and Drag especially seem like they are from a Roger Moore film. Now, I'm not saying that to knock Roger's films. I'm quite looking forward to tackling them next in this series, but just to say that I feel like the filmmakers were starting to move towards that new style for Bond films, and that doesn't play the Connery strengths. I wouldn't go so far as to say that he was miscast here, but that perhaps the film would have been a better fit for someone else. That said, after a one-film hiatus, it's fun to have Sean Connery back, and it's clear he's enjoying himself a bit more this time around. It's not quite up to what he was doing in the first 3 films, and there are times you can tell he's going through the motions. But when it's accompanied with that classic Connery flair, he's the coolest person in the room. Scaling the outside of the White House is a classic Bond moment for me, and the subsequent scene with Blofeld's reveal is my favorite scene in the entire film. It's efficient in its dialogue, stylish in its look, and mixed with that essential element of danger. We know that Bond is at Blofeld's mercy, and this is the most I feel like Charles Gray is playing the same man as Donald Pleasance or Anthony Dawson. I would say that the film greatly benefits from Connery's presence and makes it a far more enjoyable film than it otherwise might have been. On the subject of Blofeld, Gray is one of the strangest casting decisions I have seen this series make. It's not that he couldn't make for a great villain sometime down the road, but not only does he not fit the mold of the past 2 Blofelds, and it's odd that Spectre isn't even mentioned in this film, but Gray already did a memorable part in You Only Live Twice. His Blofeld often feels like another entity from the others, and that's mostly due to the direction the filmmakers went in. By going for a lighter tone, Diamonds tends to fall into the camp territory a lot, which I'm fine with, to be honest. But watching this film in sequence, I just can't make a case for Gray being a terribly interesting iteration of Blofeld. He is fun to watch, and Gray certainly isn't doing anything wrong with the part. However, this is the least interesting of all the main villains we've had so far, and he lacks the menace or the genius I feel the character should exude here. That said, I do enjoy bits and pieces from his performance when I just go with it and accept it as is. Jill St. John's Tiffany Case is a Bond woman that won't be to everyone's tastes, but I enjoy her immensely. She brings a rougher, more brash American charm to the role, and she and Connery really click for me. Not as well as somebody like Pussy Galore, but still really solid. I also like that she's just part of a longer smuggling chain and not exactly the most important link. But my favorite thing about her is that she has this sense of duplicity. For a while, you don't know which way she'll swing. She's never really an antagonist, but you don't know if she's going to stick around with Bond in the next scene. She's one of my favorite parts of this film, and it's nice to see that one of Fleming's best leading women got a decent transition into film. In the other Connery films, I always felt as though there was a clear difference between the film and the book versions of the leading women, and I often felt like the literary versions were weaker than their cinematic counterparts. After Dame Diana Rigg's fantastic turn as Tracy in the last film, Tiffany was never going to quite measure up to that standard, but she's a great companion for this adventure. The other standouts in the cast are Bruce Glover and Putter Smith as Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd respectively. They are just so much fun. They have a slimy politeness about themselves and their nasty line of work. Glover says that he was pretty much just doing Peter Lorre, and I think that's very visible. Mr. Kidd is the weaker of the two, but I wouldn't dare separate them. I like the visual contrast and I like them being gay. It doesn't really make a difference to the story, but it adds distinction to them, and I look forward to each of their scenes. There's something about their writing that reminds me of some of William Goldman's style of wit in his scripts. It's not to that same level, but they share some things in common. On my henchmen ranking list, I put these guys outside the top 10, which was a tough choice. Watching Diamonds again, I think I'd maybe bump them up a spot, but my top 10 was so crowded that I don't know who I would have left out so that they could be there. I think that speaks more to the fact that this franchise has too many fantastic villainous characters to pick from, and Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd have definitely deserved their honors as part of that group. There are a few fun presences in this film alongside the leading roles. Lana Wood's Plenty O'Toole feels like a nothing character in the story, but she does add personality to the middle section of the film, and she's fun to watch. The impact of her death, I feel, was botched completely due to the actual death being cut out of the film, but that's not her fault. Jimmy Dean is a lot like Charles Gray in that he feels like an out-of-left-field casting choice for the film, but I do like him as a different kind of ally to Bond, and like Jill St. John, he brings an American charm to the film. I can't say much about Bruce Cabot and Joseph First as Bert Saxby and Professor Dr. Metz respectively. They function within their roles fine, but don't stand out much. The real tragedy, though, is casting someone like Cabot in a role that doesn't give him much to do. If you don't know who he is, he played the romantic interest to Fay Wray in the original King Kong film and has appeared in over 100 films afterwards, with Diamonds being his final film role. It's a shame, really. Norman Burton is now the fourth actor to play Felix Leiter, and he's one of the blandest that we've had so far. After Jack Lord, it feels like this series had the hardest time trying to find someone who can inject some life into Felix and have casual audiences remembering the character from past films. Apart from John Terry in The Living Daylights, I think I can safely say that Burton is my least favorite version of Felix. MQ and Moneypenny are still continuing the good work they've been doing since the beginning, and while Moneypenny only gets 3 lines, she continues to delight. I'm glad that Q is starting to get a bit more used here, and by the time we got deep into Roger's era, Q cements himself as a smile-inducing presence in almost every outing. Due to Connery's overwhelming salary, I think the production takes a step down in order to accommodate its reduced budget. While this film has a bit more money to spend than Majesty's overall, that film also didn't have to spend $1 million of its $7 million budget in order to secure its leading man. Ken Adam returns for production design duties, and while he has some great rooms here and there, nothing stands out here like they did in the previous films. The action is also quite plain. It's not that it's terrible, but it feels uninspired in many places. The car chase around Las Vegas has a cool stunt that drives me nuts every time I see it, but the rest of it feels mundane. This is the first of 4 films where we get to see Bond involve the local police in a chase and their cars get wrecked in a more comedic fashion. It's too reminiscent of Keystone Cops for me, and it takes me out of the film. I think the best use of the gag is in Live and Let Die, but even there are a couple of bits I would have cut. By the time Diamonds Are Forever was released, Keystone Cops was over 50 years old and must have felt a bit dated by this point. My favorite action bit in the film, by the way, is the elevator fight between Peter Franks and Bond. It's a great setting due to its claustrophobic nature, and I feel like the scene makes great use of the possibilities you could do with it. Plus, the actual fighting feels like a nice callback to something like Grant's fight with Bond in From Russia with Love, thus making it one of my favorite Connery fight scenes. As per usual, John Barry steps up to the plate and delivers a fantastic score. It's not as emotionally driven or hard-hitting or risky as Majesty's, still one of his finest efforts in my mind, but it adds some much-needed class and danger. This and Thunderball are the scores that come to my mind when I think of classic John Barry Bond. The title song is absolutely pitch perfect for me. I've just always had an affinity with this one, and I think it's due to Shirley Bassey returning and the mysterious hypnotic melody that starts the song. It's hard not to be drawn into it and enjoy it. It's a close rival to You Know My Name for being my favorite title song of the series. The actual title sequence is probably the most overtly sexual that we've had in the series up to this point. It's never been quite my favorite Maurice Binder effort, but there are some great images here, such as the women pushing the diamond on the 2 sides and the cat coming in and out of the titles. I'm of 2 minds about the writing. This is the first of 3 films credited with Tom Mankiewicz as writer, and he did some uncredited work for 2 others. And after having spent quite a bit of time with his writing in the first 2 Superman films, I must say that I generally like his style of dialogue. There's an elegance and wit about several of his scenes, and when played by smart performers, it shines. However, I do take issue with the plot construction of the film. It's perhaps the most low-key of the films since Dr. No, and it does drag quite a bit in the middle. Bond continues to investigate the pipeline from Amsterdam into Vegas, and there's no real big revelations that the audience is going to care about until Blofeld shows up again. Plus, there's a lot of showcasing of the Vegas culture that feels extended, like in Circus Circus. It's not even like Guy Hamilton is doing that much unique with his directorial choices to spice up the picture. It makes for a rather laid-back style of film, and while I generally don't have a problem with that for Bond, remember that Thunderball was also a very laid-back film, there needs to be something else to help carry it. For Thunderball, I felt like there was a certain style and elegance to the filmmaking that was matched by the exotic setting. Here, I feel like Vegas doesn't quite match the intrigue and elegance of a place like the Bahamas or Istanbul, and so it's easy to get bored at times. Part of that may be because I'm fairly familiar with Las Vegas. I've been there several times in the last few years for one reason or another, and I've even stayed at Circus Circus when I was a kid long before I got into Bond, so some of the mystique is lost to me. Now, Vegas can certainly be a glamorous city. I think the Ocean's movies have done a great job at portraying the city as such. But in Diamonds, it seems a bit dull in comparison to other cities. I'm not even sure this is entirely because I've visited it, because I have also gone to places like New York, Paris, Venice, and Cortina, and yet I find that those fit right at home with Bond's world. There's a sleaziness to Las Vegas in the 70s when it was still a mob town. I feel like the mega resorts now lend themselves much better to the elegance of Bond's style, and so maybe this is just a case of unfortunate timing when choosing this setting. Despite all of my complaints, I have a good time with Diamonds Are Forever overall. Many Bond films have their problems, and some of the more problematic ones like For Your Eyes Only and No Time to Die rank quite a bit higher for me. So I guess it all depends on an individual arithmetic that only makes sense to each person while watching a film. I certainly understand why some people seem to really hate this one, but I find that it's one that I tend to stick in on more than one occasion. Other than No Time to Die, Diamonds is probably the Bond film I've watched the most in the last 3 years, and I've enjoyed the experience every time, though each viewing isn't without some slight boredom. Diamonds is not a shining example of the series like its name may suggest, but I really don't think it deserves quite the hate it gets. It's sandwiched in between two much better films, but I find that each and every Bond film has something to be enjoyed about it. Some of the things I like in Diamonds are some of the tastiest of their respective categories, like Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd or the music. And thus this film is an example to me of the pros and cons of playing it safe within a franchise. It did seem to pay off at the time, as Diamonds Are Forever was one of the highest grossing films of 1971. Critics seemed to be more positive about it than Majesty's at the time, and so James Bond as a franchise seemed to still have some life to it. And with Connery once again bowing out, we could go on to introduce a new actor who would carry the series for a whole new generation. I know this probably makes more sense to do after Never Say Never Again, but Diamonds marks the end of Connery's run with the official series, and since I didn't do one of these for David Niven, the only other actor to portray Bond in an unofficial film, I thought I'd go ahead and do it here. Sean Connery cannot be praised highly enough for his contribution to James Bond. He's the one that got the series going, cemented the blueprint for the cinematic incarnation of Bond, and for many is the only one that comes to their heads when they think of the character. All of the actors to come afterwards have been measured against him, and each has acknowledged his influence on their takes. Despite my personal preferences, I cannot thank Connery enough for getting this series started on the right foot. He brought the style and danger needed for the part. He had a timeless animal magnetism about him that made him both the coolest and the sexiest person in the room. He also knew how to play the dry humor, he handled himself well when he went about his business, and he makes for a believable secret agent, so you have a complete vision for an enduring character. It's hard not to sing his praises when watching one of his films, and it's equally hard to ever imagine another actor supplanting him as the perpetual popular choice for the best actor to play James Bond. However, not everything about his performances or his films are timeless. This is a bit of a sore spot for some people, and I know not everybody likes the idea of watching these films with modern lenses, and I get the arguments. They were made in the 60s and played to the 60s standards. It's a little like taking Tarzan out of the jungle and then criticizing him for not measuring up to modern society's ideas. It's a bit silly. What does it matter if he smokes or drinks a lot? Him killing a lot of people in cold blood is part of the character, and I don't have a problem with him using his sexuality as part of his toolset. But the things that I dislike are things I can't look past. But suffice it to say, It's a lot like when I rewatch classics like Gone with the Wind, Dumbo, Forrest Gump, or Saturday Night Fever. There are just some things that were wrong then, and they are wrong now, that leave a bad taste in my mouth in otherwise good to great films, and thus it sours the experience. Nevertheless, none of this seriously hurts the fun of watching Connery as Bond. He made it seem effortless a lot of the time, and even when he wasn't invested in the part and delivered subpar performances, he still managed to rise above many other cinematic icons. Thankfully, other actors have come along and proven themselves worthy of wearing the tux and sipping the martinis, but Connery had to carve the way forward through the forest, and that's not a small challenge. Ian Fleming's works can be cinematic, but they are often experiences that work better on paper than anywhere else. And so we needed someone who could transition us from literary Bond into something that was more appropriate for the screen. Whichever version you prefer, I am confident that the James Bond series would not have become the cinematic juggernaut that it is without Sir Sean Connery being the first to portray 007.